So, Francesco, how are we?
Oh, well, I mean, I am very depressed, Norman, because it's 2 months that I am stuck at home and I can't
So
stay
sorry.
anymore. But I see that
Ah,
you have a lot of work in front of you, and so can you work normally, or it's very, very different the situation now for you?
Francesco, I've never worked so hard in my life. I'm not traveling, which is unusual.
Yes,
Um, so I've never been in one place so long.
yes,
Um, but I'm really, I'm really stretched.
yeah. I Can you work normally, or it's difficult to work in this way?
Well, I'm doing everything that I need to do. I'm just doing things differently. So, for example, every day I end up probably being connected to anything up to, I don't know, 5, 6, 10 people. Sometimes it's a major presentation, for example, on JP Morgan.
Yeah,
I introduced a presentation on the project to all the executives in their various homes in and around New York, with material coming up on the second screen here. Um, the competition for a major project, a hospital project, also in the States on the West Coast, I ended up doing the presentation as a film with my son with a camera and a sound system round the corner in my little studio here. So, um, I'm working on a whole series of projects behind me. I'll have a video conference with the team in Madrid and one of my partners in London this afternoon. I'm also doing a lot of drawing,
oh,
which is quite interesting. So, and I'm also doing some kind of abstract paintings related to some of the designs that are for furniture, for example. I'm doing a lot of writing, and next door, if you were here, you'd look at a table, and there are probably about 20 yellow stickers. So I'm 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 involved in about, well, around 20 projects in various stages of
I see.
design.
And is the London office working normally, Norman, or
Yeah, I literally had a board meeting sitting here yesterday afternoon,
yeah?
um, with some of those board members in quite remote locations. One guy in New York,
Hmm.
various people around London, um, and and everybody is working. We're processing, projects. We've just won two new competitions, one in the Middle East, one in China. Um, uh, a project down the road from here has just restarted. A very nice project for sustaining a village, a place called La Punt. It's the project that's behind me here. So that's going into a new stage of activity. Um, I think that everything takes longer
Yeah,
because you know um, the technology enables us to do something that we couldn't have done in the past. So it enables us to do what you and I are doing now.
yes,
But probably, we've wasted, not wasted because one's ended up doing other things, but there's been a 30-minute problem through, linking up. Um, so the technology is amazing, but it's not yet perfect. And And so there's a lot of frustration around that. I'm amazed that as a practice, we are doing so much. I think that we're all working longer hours. That's, I think, one reality, because some of the things just take longer. So kind of long phone calls, video conferences, which probably by the time it's all over, we'll have got it together.
But Norman, what is your perception? When we'll be over of this nightmare? Do you think that something will change? First of all, in your work, in your practice, and afterwards, which is something even for me much more anguishing. How will be the world after this huge financial crisis that we'll have to face?
You know, it's a little bit like the whole virus itself. There's not a lot of hard facts, I mean, but there are a lot of opinions. So I guess that really the question that you pose raises lots of opinions, but they're all, it's like looking into a crystal ball. I don't know whether history tells us anything. I mean, I was reading recently that after the Spanish so-called flu in 1918-19, that it was much more devastating than coronavirus. But then, you know, for hundreds of thousands, read millions. And face masks were the law in a lot of American states. It hit very hard younger people rather than the very young and the old, which is coronavirus. So in many ways, it was much more deadly. And this reading afterwards, extraordinarily, there was a building boom for large cinemas, which would bring lots of people very, very close together. Yeah. And you then had the period of the so-called Roaring Twenties, when you had this explosion of modern culture, of dance, of painting, so kind of one reading of history is that people perhaps forget quite quickly and return to normality. That's one reading. Another reading is that, you know, I talked to the head of a hospital here, and he's saying, I don't think we will see normality for another 2 years. I think that people will still keep distance, they'll still be taking precautions. So in that scenario, it's very different, and life will be different, and density will be lower. People will be further apart. I'd like to believe that that is not the future. I'd like to believe that, that technology, as in the past, will come to the rescue. Whether that's been the great earthquake of Lisbon, which heralded seismic construction, the Great Fire of London, which brought in the London as we know it now, which is brickwork and recessed windows, which we take for granted, or modern sanitation, which was the response to cholera, or vaccines. So, you know, so being an optimist, I think that that technology will come to the rescue, that vaccines will, and some of the things that we might attribute to the coronavirus and a new sensitivity to touching things, those will happen anyway, because when I go into the Hearst building, and we created that, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, you don't have buttons in the elevators. You press the floor, you know, I go in and I press 2.5 and it comes up, elevator C, I go to C and I don't touch anything. And I can see that it's, you know, face recognition is already with us. So I can see that, you know, I walk into an office building and doors either open or close depending on who I am. But that probably would have happened anyway. And historians in the future, rather like, you know, when I use a bathroom now, I can recall that perhaps, or I go on the embankment in London, or I take an underground, and yes, the historian will remind me that that is all the result of cholera in the middle of the 19th century, and Joseph Bazalgette, who came along, created this sewage system, combined it with the beautiful embankment. That would have happened probably anyway, but it was hastened by cholera. So I think that some of the technological changes, historians will in the future say, do you realize that perhaps your ability for that door to lock, that door to open, those lights to switch on or go dark, was influenced by something that happened around 2020. So you know, but then this is an opinion, and I think that, you know, we those of us who've grown up through, you know, a world war, a Cold War, where we've seen, you know, poor kids in iron lungs, which were the precursor of the ventilators, that we now have these horrific images. I mean, I can remember horrific images of young kids in these iron lungs. It was very painful. It was the only way that they could breathe. The birth of modern architecture was in many ways, in part, the sanatorium, the open air, and that was the cure for tuberculosis. And now, interestingly, those of us who here in Switzerland who can go outside and meet up, we always choose a fresh air setting. So maybe, you know, and also I don't think this is the end of globalization, but it might be a new version of globalization. It might call into question why, say, one country produces all the flowers in the world and then they're exported all around the world, and why one country dominates the drug chain. It might call into question, it might bring a new wave of semi-autonomy, where perhaps again a trend that we could already see of agriculture moving from the country because water starts to get short and you don't have mobility which is dependent on fossil fuels. So you don't have the byproducts of fossil fuels, which are fertilizers. So why would you use so much water? Why would you produce in the countryside to then ship to the city? Wouldn't you be using hydroponics, aeroponics, producing fresher produce locally? We're already seeing the symptoms of this with aerofarms in New Jersey, just outside New York, producing more efficiently fresher produce, which chefs are kind of proclaiming. So again, maybe the awareness of the fragility of supply chains hastens something that was perhaps already going to happen. If you take the fires in California, the result of the aging infrastructure, Pacific Gas and Electric, already bankrupt, and all those long kind of cables, you know, you have a wind, it blows over, it sets fire to trees, it triggers, and then you've got 2.5 million Californians without power. They're buying generators. So maybe, again, this big infrastructure of power cables, and maybe a new age of very clean nuclear, container-sized nuclear batteries, safe, clean, whether it's that, whether it's a sort of hastening of battery technology which enables solar to be more reliable 24 hours 7. And again, maybe coronavirus hastens those trends towards autonomy in terms of supply chains, energy, processing of waste. I don't know, random thoughts, Francesco.
No, I mean, it seems that really we need a kind of global New Deal to improve all the system of our infrastructures, but also to exploit the possibility of the new technology. This will be the big challenge of the next years. But I see that you are...
Francesco, I think that your reference to the New Deal is interesting. I think that civilizations go through massive traumas, shake-ups, plagues, wars, and they then kind of reshape. They're kind of seismic shifts, and I think it's very difficult to know fully what the consequences of this one will be. I think what you can say is there will be consequences. I mean, again, it's almost now a cliche to refer to, say, a talk that Bill Gates gave 5 years ago, and he was writing almost the script, word for word, of what we're witnessing now. And the hope is that society will learn from this. I think this occurs at a point of political fragmentation, and again a questioning of the kind of big power blocks. I think the ugly side of that is the worst of nationalism. The potential bright side of that is a move towards more autonomous systems in a positive sense and not a politically negative sense. So if you could have the best of both worlds, less dependence on the bigger systems, but you had the benefits of larger research facilities, political accord in terms of what constitutes a crisis, and a crisis is global right now. Climate change is global. If you could have the best of both of those worlds, I mean, that would be an extraordinary positive outcome. The negative outcomes, of course, I mean, are already writ there. I guess that for me, if I had to do a gross oversimplification, something like this magnifies those trends and those symptoms, positive and negative, which are already in the air. Or we can start to see those as positive and negative systems, politically and socially.
But all what you said, Norman, implies also the idea that probably we need also a different culture and role for the political process of taking decision. I mean, I had the impression that during this emergency, the political people just gave the power of the decision to the scientists, which is, in my opinion, understandable, but they are lacking. They are lacking the culture and the moral stature, I would say, too, of facing all the social and political consequences of this crisis. When I heard this statement by Bill Gates, he was posing exactly this problem, because to resolve the great crisis, you need to have very strong political decisions, a very strong political class running the complexity of the problems. And I think that one of the dangers we are going through is that this would be, in the end, only of the scientists.
Hey!
Norman,
Hi there. I'm okay. How are you?
I'm tired. I'm so tired, Norman. I cannot stay. I cannot stay anymore.
Oh, don't. I feel for you.
Are you okay?
Yes, you know, I'm very privileged. I'm here in the Engadine Valley, as you know, and
I
the
know.
weather's great today. It varies, and so, you know, in between writing and kind of sitting in front of this screen, uh, I'm pretty occupied. But can you go out in Venice? I mean,
I can go out, obviously with the mask and gloves, and but the city, the town is still pretty empty, and afterwards, you know, there are not social place where you can go. You cannot go to have a coffee or to drink anything.
that's
And,
terrible, isn't it? Switzerland is, I mean, Switzerland's had a lot of cases, a lot of deaths, but next Monday everything opens, and we'll see.
we'll see.
Listen, before we had the technical problems last time, were you getting anything that was interesting or helpful in terms of
Well, I think that
Casabella, or you know, some of the things that you're doing meanwhile you're locked down?
no, I mean, I think that all what you said is pretty interesting. Also, because you were developing a very clear perception of the situation we are going through, and during our conversation, you put a lot of attention on the fact that probably this deep crisis will go through, will produce a jump or speeding up the technological transformations that will let let us give the possibility to overcome crises like this. And in all your speech was very, very strong, as far as I perceived, was very, very strong this attitude, Norman. Technology, we have to have to nourish a great faith in the possibility and the improvement of technology. And I would like to conclude our the first stage of our conversation going through again to this point, and to know if my perception is correct or not.
Yes, I mean, Francesco, if I tried to kind of not sum it up, but just to talk fairly broadly, as a practice, the whole idea of sustainability goes back to the very first day of the practice in 1967. And all the projects then and since then have been very consistent. And the projects then were about recycling, they were about buildings that worked with nature, that were climate controlled, but had a high degree of natural ventilation. Now, if I look back from where we are now, I'd say that we'd pioneered that idea in the most difficult kinds of buildings, very shallow buildings like the one I'm here. I mean, here, I just open that window behind me and I get fresh air. And that is, you know, centuries old. The whole of Venice is built on that proposition. What is much more difficult is to do that in a very tall building and to do it in a very deep building. And those buildings where we've done that, in building like, say, the so-called Swiss Re, the Gherkin, or Commerzbank as top buildings, they're very autonomous. So if you take Swiss Re, every floor is divided into 5 zones. Everything's decentralized so that you can open the facade, you can move air. Now, we've done that, and in deep buildings like Bloomberg in London or Apple in Silicon Valley. We've done it for 2 reasons. One is it's a healthier building, and the other is that it reduces energy. And when you take it with other systems, if you combine it, for example, with the 10,000 trees in the landscape of Apple, then it's carbon restorative. I mean, it's absorbing thousands of tons of carbon dioxide every year. Now, right now, there's a big, big question, because what you don't want to do is what so many sealed, air-conditioned buildings do, which is they mostly recycle used air and they rely on filters in the system to clean that air, but they're essentially recirculating stale air. Now, what we've done in terms of creating healthier buildings in a non-pandemic environment is suddenly very relevant, because we're talking about buildings which are very close to being outside. They're bringing in fresh air and they're taking out fresh air. They're filtering it before it comes in Bloomberg, because you've got heavy traffic outside. you have less of a problem in a Cupertino landscape. So it's not just the number of air changes. The air changes in Bloomberg are twice what you would normally expect. In Commerzbank, they're probably 20 times. That is good news, but it's not just that. It's the fact that it's not recirculating stale air. And of course, that is, that is really dangerous in an infectious environment, which is why probably all of us in the transition period, until we get back to a past normality, and I'm confident that we will, whether that's vaccines or whatever. I mean, the future of humanity is not going to be everybody's 2 meters apart. No way. And the past pandemic of so-called Spanish flu was much more vicious. It claimed 10 times the number of lives that this is causing. That doesn't underestimate where we are now, but within a very short period of time after that pandemic, people were building cinemas on a huge scale, the new age of the cinema. That was very, very shortly afterwards. So I think my proposition is that you need that the coronavirus will hasten tendencies which we're already aware of towards decentralization, and whether that's decentralization within a building or whether it's decentralization in terms of supply chains and nations. And the other is resilience. So those buildings which are more adaptable, more resilient. And if you take Bloomberg, you can run up and down the spiral rammed staircase in the middle. You don't have to get into an elevator. You can use those systems of fresh air in all kinds of ways. And so you're combining in a building like that, very high technology, you're using a vacuum system normally found in aircraft for all the bathrooms, which is harvesting grey water, recycling it using 1/5 of the water that you would use in a conventional system. But you don't see it. I mean, you're not, when you go into a bathroom, it's just like any other bathroom. And so it's, and the ceiling, you look up at the ceiling and you think it's kind of, it's kind of a glamorous ceiling. It's fun. Of course, it's doing the lighting, it's doing the acoustics, and it's also, depending on the weather, it's either a very hot surface or a cold surface, so it's modifying the air. So in the same way that Masdar was able to achieve, as an experiment, and continues to achieve, a community, 7 days, 24 hours, 365 days, powered solely by solar energy. It is because it has learned from past traditions of how people created a cool environment before electricity, before modern services, just working with nature. You're combining that in Masdar with the state-of-the-art technology. So, and I think that whether I probably instance the example of California, 2.5 million people, fires, aging infrastructure, pylons coming down next to trees on fire. So the concept of the heavy infrastructure, already that's been called into question in ways that we've completely forgotten. I mean, for example, it wasn't that long ago within my memory that you had very large public laundries, so that everybody's washing would go to a great collective, highly centralized. you had telephone exchanges with thousands of people manually moving plugs in and out and connecting people. All of that's become totally decentralized. And I think that probably one of the effects, and you can see the same tendency, the undercurrent, in terms of nations politically. And of course, like anything, there's an upside and a downside. I mean, in terms of a supply chain of drugs, if you're not dependent on one nation for, 80% of the drugs in the world, and if you can decentralize that and you can offset the downsides of globalization by reactivating the rust belts in America, or the rural farming which is in decline because of the growth of the big centralized farms. If you can decentralize, but how do you have the benefits of that with the advantages of global collaboration? Which is, so, if you're trading together, you're less likely to be going to war together. So, in a way, trade, global trade, is good. How do you have the advantages of global cooperation to create, say, a vaccine against this pandemic, with an awareness that probably this pandemic, when it's over, is not the end of pandemics. It's not the end of the marathon. Likely, it's the start of a new marathon. On
the basis of what you said, Norman, what we are always thinking in terms of different types of building, and from your observations, I have the perception that what we have to think is also to invent new types of buildings. In other terms, we have the type of the skyscraper, we have the type of the housing complex that are going back to a very long tradition. And probably what we are saying is that we have to change this our attitude, and to think that we have to create and experiment some types of buildings and construction which are not part of a shared tradition or accepted tradition. Is this perception correct?
I think it is. Just let me silence this phone, which is ringing in my pocket. Somebody I need to call back and mute my phone. Two things cross my mind, and I never thought of them as related. So let me just come at a possible new building type, which might be strengthened by one of the longer-term tendencies which might have come out of this pandemic. The high-rise building and the mechanism of an elevator which makes that possible. You cannot, the high-rise building is not going to go away. Everybody was saying that 9/11, that was the end of it. It was the beginning of a new wave of high-rise buildings. But in a transition period, then in that transition period, there's going to be a sensitivity to people being very close together in elevators. So you may find that you're booking slots in an elevator with an awareness that more and more of the buildings that we've done, for example, the Hong Kong Bank, going back to 1979, has many of its a secondary system of escalators between floors. Comcast, which we've recently finished, has a lot of intermovement between floors, independent of the elevator system. So, and Bloomberg, for example, I instanced the spiral ramp, which connects all the levels together. So, and probably the rationing of movement in an elevator is going to be encouraged by the reality, which is perhaps a more persistent remnant of the current pandemic, and that is that because of being forced to work at home, a lot of people will elect in the future to spend more time at home. So I think that there'll be a greater fluidity between our place of work and where we live. Now, put all of that to one side. One small project, which you're perhaps aware of, it's really quite small. It's not too far from here. It's in a village called La Punt. And last year, I launched this project to a series of town hall meetings. La Punt is a village of 800 people. And La Punt, like so many rural villages in Italy, Spain, France, rural America, they have a problem. They are, for a number of reasons, the way in which farming has become automated, so it's no longer labor intensive. So families running farms are in decline. The farms are being bought up by big conglomerates. Similarly, the whole pattern of mobility, less dependence on trains, the growth of large-scale shopping, undermining the individual shop in a village. Put it all together, and La Punt is fairly typical. 40 young people left last year, the year before, a huge percentage, and so two entrepreneurs who happen to have very close ties to this village. They live there for part of the year. They have an investment in there. One owns a hotel. The other is a young entrepreneur who's created probably one of the most successful new brands of athletic shoes. They've come together and they were inspired. One of them, the main entrepreneur, was inspired by a visit to the foundation in Madrid. And afterwards he came up and he said, the foundation's given me an idea. And the idea is this, that the big tech companies mostly, but not just the tech companies, in the cities are competing more and more for the top talent. So it's really what kind of lifestyle we can offer. So you can work at home, you can work in the headquarters in the city. What if you had a third place where you could do a project away, you could go with your family, it would be like a vacation. You would be combining alpine sports, hiking in the summer, biking, fishing, in the winter, cross-country skiing, skating, downhill skiing, trekking, and if we created a third place, let's call it a hub, then that could also be a place where local businesses could also have another. So if it's a cafe, the cafe has a presence there. If it's an organic farmer, the organic farmer will have somewhere where he can sell the produce, and then will also have accommodation. So that was before all of this pandemic. But of course, when I when I then say, well, one of the longer term effects is that, and this may be quite beneficial, is that you have more than one place. And it's interesting, JP Morgan, the project which is under construction, is going ahead. I've got a video conference this afternoon on that project. The essential work is going on below ground, the non-essential work is stopped, but the project is moving ahead. I predict that, I mean, I made a presentation, I headed out a presentation to the board, and they're all in their different homes in and around New York. Now, I think that when we have the transition period, I suspect they'll all be going, obviously, to their headquarters, to the new headquarters. But I could see that pattern of work may be less centralized in the same way that supply systems, I mean, politically, of course, the downside of this that we're already seeing as a tendency is for a rise of nationalism, you know, little Britons, little this, little that, autocracy and so on. That there's always, you know, a yin to a yang. There's always a downside to an upside. But if one was optimistic, you might say that one of the tendencies which will be accelerated is a richer, more productive lifestyle. That was rather a long soliloquy.
Okay, Norman. You should conclude here because you gave such positive forecast or preview of what we are going through that I would like to keep it.
Okay.
I do hope to see you pretty soon, but I am not so sure that this will happen, but let's guess.
Well, we need a good meal, a good bottle of wine,
absolutely.
a good terrace.
This is what we need, Norman. Okay.
Meanwhile.
A great bottle, yes. We'll have a great bottle sometime.
We look forward.
Okay, Norman. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Good to talk. Keep